In a sprawling metropolis where the moon's whispers lead to madness, our sleep story unfolds a narrative of haunting horror. Will you join me as the city's darkest tales come to life? The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, casting a gray pallor over the streets of New York. James, with his collar turned up and hat pulled low, made his way through the maze of cobblestone streets towards the Sun's office. The weight of another day's work pressed on his shoulders, the stories of the day mundane and uneventful. But as he approached the building, he noticed a figure standing in the doorway, a silhouette barely distinguishable against the dim light of the interior. It was Mr. Whitman, the enigmatic editor-in-chief. His presence outside the office was unusual, and his posture, rigid and expectant, gave James pause. Whitman's eyes, usually hidden behind a veil of indifference, now bore into James with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "James," Whitman began, his voice a gravelly whisper that seemed to carry the weight of a secret. He extended a hand, revealing a sealed envelope. The wax seal was unfamiliar, stamped with an insignia James couldn't quite place. "This," Whitman continued, "is not your usual assignment." James took the envelope, the weight of it surprising. It felt as though it contained more than just paper. "What is this?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Whitman leaned in closer, the scent of tobacco and old books wafting from him. "A chance," he murmured, "for you to change everything, to make a name for yourself in ways you've never imagined." James looked from the envelope to Whitman, searching the older man's face for a hint of jest or insincerity. But Whitman's gaze was unwavering, his expression grave. "Publish what's inside," he said, "and the world will never be the same." With that, Whitman turned and disappeared into the building, leaving James standing in the rain, the mysterious envelope clutched in his hand. The drizzle seemed to grow colder, the world around him suddenly filled with shadows and whispers. The promise of a life-changing opportunity weighed heavily in his grasp, and as he stared at the sealed envelope, he felt the pull of destiny tugging at him, urging him to unveil the secrets within. The dim light of his study barely pierced the thickening gloom outside. James sat at his desk, the mysterious envelope before him. The wax seal, with its cryptic insignia, seemed to pulse under the lamplight, beckoning him to break it open. With a deep breath, he slid a knife under the seal, the wax giving way with a soft crack. Inside, he found a sheaf of papers, the edges worn and yellowed with age. The handwriting was meticulous, each letter crafted with precision, as if the writer had taken great care to ensure every word was perfectly legible. But it wasn't the handwriting that caught James's attention, it was the content. The papers contained detailed accounts of the moon, but not the barren, lifeless satellite everyone knew. Instead, they described a world teeming with life. There were sketches of vast forests with trees that reached into the heavens, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their leaves shimmering with a silvery glow. There were oceans, not of water, but of some luminescent liquid that ebbed and flowed with a rhythm all its own. But it was the creatures that truly captivated James. There were beings that resembled humans, but with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like twin moons. There were creatures that fluttered on gossamer wings, their bodies emitting a soft, ethereal light. And there were beasts, massive and powerful, with scales that sparkled like a night sky filled with stars. As he delved deeper into the accounts, James found references to civilizations that had risen and fallen on the moon's surface. Great cities built from moonstone, their spires reaching for the stars. Temples dedicated to deities unknown to man, their altars stained with the essence of lunar sacrifices. The more he read, the more James felt a chill creep up his spine. The accounts were so detailed, so vivid, that they couldn't possibly be the product of mere imagination. But if they were real, How had no one ever seen these wonders? How had such a world remained hidden from humanity's gaze? He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. The room seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, the silence oppressive. The moon, visible through the window, hung heavy in the sky, its pale light casting an eerie glow over the room. James felt its pull, a silent call that whispered of mysteries yet to be unveiled. But with those mysteries came a sense of unease. If these accounts were true, what else lay hidden in the vastness of space? What other secrets were waiting to be discovered, and at what cost? The evening had settled into a quiet lull when James decided to share the contents of the envelope with Clara. Their modest living room, adorned with worn-out furniture and a few cherished mementos, was bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace. Clara, with her raven-black hair cascading down her back, sat on the couch, engrossed in a book. The gentle flicker of the flames played upon her face, casting shadows that danced with her every movement. "Clara," James began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I need to show you." She looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his. There was a depth to them, a curiosity that always sought the mysteries of the world. Setting her book aside, she motioned for him to sit next to her. He handed her the sheaf of papers, watching as her eyes scanned the detailed accounts and sketches. As the minutes ticked by, a transformation overtook her. The casual curiosity in her eyes was replaced by a fervent intensity, her fingers tracing the outlines of the moon's bizarre inhabitants. These are incredible," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "Can they be real?" James nodded slowly, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. "It's either the most elaborate hoax I've ever seen, or something far beyond our understanding." The two of them spent hours poring over the documents, discussing the implications of such a discovery. Clara, with her background in astronomy, speculated on the moon's environment, the possible ecosystems, and the evolution of its inhabitants. Their conversations delved deep into the night, fueled by a mixture of excitement and trepidation. But as the hours waned, James noticed a change in Clara. Her initial excitement began to shift into an obsession. She spoke of the moon not as a distant celestial body, but as a living, breathing entity. She mused about the messages it might be sending, the secrets it whispered to those willing to listen. "Imagine," she said, her voice distant, "if we could communicate with them, learn from them. They've seen the rise and fall of their civilizations, the ebb and flow of their world. What wisdom might they share?" James watched her, a growing unease settling in his chest. The Clara he knew was grounded, rational, but now she seemed to be drifting away, pulled into the gravitational force of the moon's mysteries. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Clara," he implored, "we must tread carefully. We don't know what we're dealing with." She turned to him, her eyes distant yet burning with a fervor he had never seen before. "James," she whispered, "we're on the cusp of something monumental. We can't turn back now." And as the first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, James realized that their lives had irrevocably changed. The moon, once a silent sentinel in the night sky, had become an enigma that threatened to consume them both. The offices of the sun were a cacophony of clattering typewriters, ringing telephones, and the murmured conversations of reporters chasing their next big story. James sat at his desk, the sheaf of papers from the mysterious envelope spread out before him. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. To publish or not to publish? His colleagues had no inkling of the explosive content he held. To them, it was just another day, another deadline. But for James, it was a crossroads that could define his career, and perhaps the very fabric of society's understanding of the universe. He remembered Whitman's words, the promise of a life-changing opportunity. But with that promise came responsibility. The potential for panic, for chaos, was real. Yet the allure of the unknown, the siren call of a story that could redefine journalism, was irresistible. Taking a deep breath, he penned an introduction, framing the accounts as a groundbreaking discovery. He chose his words carefully, aiming to intrigue rather than alarm. And with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration, he handed the story to the printing department. The next morning, New York City woke up to a headline that would be remembered for generations: Mysteries of the Moon, a world beyond imagination. The article, spread across multiple pages, detailed the bizarre creatures, the luminescent oceans, and the ancient civilizations that might exist just 250,000 miles away. The reaction was instantaneous. Copies of The Sun flew off the stands. Newsboys shouted the headlines on street corners, their voices echoing through the canyons of the city. Everywhere, people huddled together, discussing the revelations with a mix of wonder and disbelief. The Sun's offices were inundated with calls. Scientists, skeptics, and curious readers all wanted to know more. Was this the truth or an elaborate ruse? Debates raged in cafes, lecture halls, and living rooms. The city, it seemed, had been gripped by lunar fever. James watched the frenzy from the window of his office, the city below a living, breathing entity reacting to his words. The power of the press, the influence of a single story was laid bare before him. He had ignited the imagination of an entire city and perhaps changed the course of history. But with the adulation came a gnawing doubt. Had he done the right thing? Only time would tell. The nights following the publication were restless ones for Clara. As the city buzzed with the revelations of the Sun, she found herself drawn, night after night, to the window of their small apartment. The moon, hanging heavy and luminous in the sky, seemed to beckon her with an irresistible pull. At first, James thought little of it. It was only natural, he reasoned, for Clara to be captivated by the celestial body that had so dominated their lives in recent days. But as the nights turned into weeks, her fascination took on a more obsessive quality. Each evening, as twilight gave way to the inky blackness of night, Clara would set up a small telescope on their balcony. She'd spend hours, her eye pressed to the eyepiece, scanning the moon's surface. Occasionally, she'd jot down notes, her hand moving feverishly as she scribbled her observations. To an outsider, it might have seemed a harmless, if somewhat eccentric, hobby. But James began to notice subtle changes in Clara. She'd whisper to herself, her words a soft, unintelligible murmur. Sometimes she'd laugh, a soft, eerie giggle that sent shivers down James's spine. And on more than one occasion, he'd wake in the dead of night to find her standing by the window, her silhouette illuminated by the moon's pale glow, her gaze fixed on the distant orb. One evening, as James was preparing for bed, he overheard Clara speaking. Thinking she was on the phone, he approached the balcony. But as he drew closer, he realized she was alone, her words directed at the moon. "They're there," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. "I can see them. The cities, the creatures. It's all real." James watched, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. The line between reality and obsession seemed to be blurring for Clara. The moon, with its enigmatic allure, had ensnared her, and James feared what it might demand in return. The apartment, once filled with the soft hum of shared life, began to echo with a palpable tension. Mornings, which used to be marked by shared cups of coffee and gentle conversations, now found Clara lost in a daze, her thoughts miles away, or perhaps 250,000 miles on the moon's surface. James tried to bridge the growing chasm. He'd initiate conversations about their friends, recent events in the city, or even the weather. But Clara's responses were always curt, her mind clearly elsewhere, and inevitably, every discussion would circle back to her lunar observations. "It's not just barren landscapes, James," she'd say, her voice taking on a fervent pitch. "There are patterns, movements. There's life up there." James would nod, trying to engage, to understand. But the more he listened, the more he felt like he was losing the woman he loved to a world beyond their reach. Their once intimate dinners became silent affairs, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the distant sounds of the city below. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, James mustered the courage to address the elephant in the room. "Clara," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I'm worried about you. This obsession with the moon, it's changing you." She looked up, her eyes, once warm and inviting, now cold and distant. "You wouldn't understand," she replied tersely. "There's a whole world up there, waiting to be discovered. And I'm close, James. I'm so close to unlocking its secrets." James reached out, taking her hands in his. They felt cold, detached. "Clara," he implored, "we need to reconnect, to find our way back to each other." She pulled away, her gaze returning to the window, to the moon that hung outside, casting its silvery glow over the world. "I can't," she whispered. "Not now. Not when I'm so close." And as the days turned into weeks, James felt the woman he loved slipping further and further away, lost to the mysteries of a world beyond their grasp. The nights grew longer, and with them, the shadows that seemed to cling to Clara deepened. The once vibrant woman, full of life and laughter, was now a specter, her days spent in a trance-like state, her nights consumed by the moon's call. James would often wake in the dead of night to find the bed beside him cold and empty. Following the soft murmurs that echoed through their apartment, he'd find Clara on the balcony, her face bathed in the moon's pale light, whispering to the night. One such night, as James approached her, he heard her speak with a clarity that had been absent for weeks. "They're trying to tell us," she murmured, her voice quivering with a mix of awe and fear. "They're warning us, James." He wrapped an arm around her, trying to draw her away from the moon's hypnotic pull. "Who, Clara? Who's trying to warn us?" She turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with tears. "The beings on the moon. They've seen it, James. They've seen the end." The weight of her words hung in the air, a palpable dread that seemed to seep into the very walls of their home. "The end of what?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara gripped his arms, her fingers digging into his flesh. "The end of everything. They've lived through it, seen civilizations rise and fall, and now they're trying to warn us, to save us from our own doom." James tried to calm her, to bring her back from the brink of whatever abyss she was teetering on. "Clara, it's just stories, tales spun from imagination. We can't let them consume us." But Clara shook her head, her gaze returning to the moon. "It's real, James, and we're running out of time." The days that followed were marked by Clara's growing agitation. She'd pace the apartment, muttering about lunar signals and impending catastrophes. She spoke of tidal waves, of cities consumed by fire, of a world on the brink of annihilation. James watched, helpless, as the woman he loved descended into a madness fueled by celestial prophecies. The line between reality and delusion had blurred for Clara, and he feared that if he didn't act soon, he'd lose her forever to the moon's haunting call. The city's hustle and bustle felt like a distant hum to James as he walked the streets, his mind a whirlwind of concern and desperation. The once familiar landmarks seemed alien, distorted by the weight of his worries. Clara's rapid descent into what he could only describe as madness had left him reeling, and he knew he needed help. He first sought the counsel of Dr. Samuel, an old friend from college who had become a renowned psychiatrist. The doctor's office, a room filled with the scent of old books and leather, felt like a sanctuary from the chaos outside. Dr. Samuel, with his silver hair and kind eyes, listened intently as James recounted the events of the past weeks. "It sounds like a severe case of delusional disorder," Dr. Samuel mused, steepling his fingers. "The fixation on the moon, the belief in its messages. It's not uncommon for external events to trigger such episodes." James leaned forward, desperation evident in his eyes. "But how do I bring her back, Samuel? How do I pull her out of this?" Dr. Samuel sighed, his gaze sympathetic. "It won't be easy, James. She needs professional intervention, perhaps even a stay in a facility where she can be monitored." The thought of committing Clara to an institution sent a chill down James's spine. He remembered the asylums of old, the whispered tales of patients subjected to barbaric treatments. "There has to be another way," he pleaded. "We could try therapy, counseling," Dr. Samuel offered, "but she has to be willing." And that was the crux of the problem. Every time James broached the subject of seeking help, Clara would become agitated, her voice rising in pitch as she accused him of not believing her, of trying to silence the moon's messages. One evening, in a last-ditch effort, James arranged for a psychologist to visit their home. Dr. Eleanor, a young woman with a reputation for handling challenging cases, arrived with a calm demeanor, her presence a soothing balm. But the moment she introduced herself and her intentions, Clara's demeanor shifted. "You think I'm mad," Clara hissed, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You all do, but I'm the only one who sees the truth." Dr. Eleanor tried to reason with her, her voice gentle yet firm. "Clara, we're just trying to help, to understand." But Clara was having none of it. She retreated to the balcony, her sanctuary, leaving James and Dr. Eleanor in a tense silence. James felt the walls closing in, the weight of Clara's condition pressing down on him. The road to her recovery seemed fraught with obstacles, and he feared that the woman he loved was slipping further and further away. The Sun's archives were a labyrinthine maze, a repository of stories and secrets that spanned decades. The room, located in the basement of the building, was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of light that pierced the gloom, and the only sound was the distant hum of the building's old ventilation system. James descended the creaky stairs, a lantern in hand, its feeble light casting eerie shadows on the walls. He had been here many times before, searching for old articles or references, but today's quest was personal. He needed answers, a way to understand the origins of the moon stories that had so consumed Clara. Rows upon rows of shelves filled with bound volumes and boxes stretched out before him. He began his search methodically, pulling out editions from the weeks leading up to the publication of the moon stories. Hours seemed to blur into one another as he pored over articles, advertisements, and editorials, searching for any clue, any hint of the source of the tales. As the night wore on, fatigue began to set in. His eyes grew heavy, the words on the pages blurring together. But just as he was about to give up, a small, inconspicuous note in the margin of one of the pages caught his eye. It read, "See manuscript M237 for full account." Heart racing, James began scouring the shelves, searching for the referenced manuscript. And after what felt like an eternity, he found it, a thick, leather-bound volume, its cover worn and faded. The title, embossed in gold, simply read, "Lunar Chronicles." With trembling hands, James opened the manuscript. The pages inside were filled with the same meticulous handwriting he had seen in the envelope, the accounts even more detailed and expansive. But what truly caught his attention was a series of letters and correspondences tucked into the back of the volume. They were exchanges between the author of the manuscript and various editors at The Sun, dating back years. The discussions revolved around the veracity of the accounts, debates on whether they were fit for publication, and concerns about the potential impact on readers. As James delved deeper into the letters, a chilling realization dawned on him. The stories had been known to The Sun for years, perhaps even decades. They had been kept hidden, locked away in the archives, deemed too controversial, too dangerous for the public. But why? And more importantly, who had decided to finally bring them to light? With a growing sense of unease, James knew he was on the cusp of uncovering a mystery that ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. Tucked away in a dusty corner of the archives, James stumbled upon another set of manuscripts, distinct from the Lunar Chronicles. These were bound in faded blue cloth, the spine embossed with the name Dr. Alistair Harrow. Curiosity piqued, James began to leaf through the pages. The beginning was filled with scientific jargon, charts, and diagrams, But as he delved deeper, the true nature of the work became apparent. Dr. Harrow had been obsessed with the moon, but not its physical properties or potential inhabitants. Instead, his focus was on its psychological effects on the human psyche. The manuscript detailed countless observations of individuals under the moon's phases. There were notes on mood swings, changes in behavior, and even physical transformations. Dr. Harrow postulated that the moon, with its ever-changing cycles, had a profound impact on the human mind, an influence that went beyond mere folklore or superstition. As James read on, he discovered that Dr. Harrow had once been a respected figure in the scientific community, a pioneer in the field of lunar psychology. But over time, his theories grew more radical, his claims more outlandish. He spoke of a lunar resonance, a frequency emitted by the moon that resonated with the human brain, altering thoughts, emotions, and even memories. The scientific community, initially intrigued by Harrow's work, soon turned against him. His peers labeled him a charlatan, a madman driven by obsession. His research was discredited, his findings mocked. And yet, as James pored over the meticulous notes, the detailed observations, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a kernel of truth in Harrow's work. Tucked between the pages, James found a newspaper clipping. It was an obituary dated some 20 years prior. Dr. Alistair Harrow, disgraced scientist, found dead in his study. The article spoke of a brilliant mind lost to obsession, a man who had pushed the boundaries of science only to be shunned by those he sought to enlighten. James sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. If Harrow's theories were true, if the moon did indeed have such a profound impact on the human mind, then Clara's descent into madness took on a whole new meaning. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, James realized that he was on the brink of uncovering a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. In the latter half of Dr. Harrow's manuscripts, the tone shifted from observational to experimental. James, with a growing sense of dread, began to read about the lunar exposure trials. Harrow had constructed a chamber, a room devoid of all light save for that of the moon. Using a series of mirrors and lenses, he had amplified the moon's rays, creating an environment where subjects would be bathed in pure, unfiltered moonlight. The goal? To study the immediate and prolonged effects of lunar exposure on the human psyche. The initial experiments seemed harmless. Subjects reported feelings of calm, a heightened sense of awareness, and even euphoria. But as the exposure times increased, the results became more disturbing. One subject, after 3 hours in the chamber, began to speak in tongues, uttering phrases in a language that Harrow couldn't identify. Another, after a 6-hour exposure, became catatonic, her eyes fixed on some unseen point, unresponsive to external stimuli. But the most chilling account was that of a subject who had been exposed for a full 12 hours. The man, previously of sound mind, emerged from the chamber a changed individual. He spoke of visions, of cities on the moon, of beings that whispered secrets of the cosmos. And most disturbingly, he spoke of a great reckoning, a cataclysmic event that would reshape the very fabric of reality. Harrow's notes grew more frantic, his writing more erratic. He spoke of the burden of knowledge, of truths too vast for the human mind to comprehend. And as the experiments progressed, it became clear that Harrow himself had entered the chamber, subjecting himself to the moon's enigmatic pull. The final pages of the manuscript were filled with scribbles, diagrams of celestial bodies, and a repeated phrase: "The moon sees all, knows all." James closed the manuscript, his hands trembling. The implications of Harrow's work were staggering. If the moon did indeed have such a profound impact on the human mind, then the stories, the tales of lunar civilizations, might not be mere fabrications. They could be memories, fragments of truths long forgotten, now resurfacing with devastating consequences. And as James sat in the dimly lit archive, surrounded by the weight of history, he realized that he was not just fighting for Clara's sanity, but perhaps for the very soul of humanity. The offices of the Sun were abuzz with activity, reporters darting to and fro, the clatter of typewriters providing a constant backdrop. But for James, the world had narrowed to a single point, the imposing wooden door of Mr. Whitman's office. Without waiting for an invitation, James burst into the room, his face a mask of determination. Whitman, seated behind his desk, looked up, his normally unflappable demeanor showing a hint of surprise. "James," he began, his voice dripping with feigned warmth, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" James slammed the manuscript onto the desk, the pages scattering. "You knew," he hissed, his voice trembling with anger. "You knew about Harrow's experiments, about the effects of the moon, and yet you published those stories. Why?" Whitman leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Ah, Dr. Harrow," he mused, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "A brilliant mind, but tragically misunderstood." James's patience was wearing thin. "Answer the question, Whitman. Why did you publish those stories?" Whitman's gaze hardened, the affable facade slipping away. "For the greater good, James," he replied, his voice cold. "The world needed to know, to be prepared." "Prepared for what?" James demanded, his heart racing. Whitman leaned forward, his eyes locked onto James's. "For the reckoning," he whispered. "The moon has watched us, James, studied us, and it has deemed us unworthy." James recoiled, the weight of Whitman's words hitting him like a physical blow. "You're mad!" he spat, his voice filled with disbelief. Whitman chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Perhaps," he mused, "or perhaps I'm the only one who sees the bigger picture. The stories, the experiments, they were all necessary. A way to awaken the world, to prepare it for what's to come." James felt a chill run down his spine. "And what is to come, Whitman?" Whitman leaned back, a smile playing on his lips. "Only the moon knows," he replied cryptically. James, realizing he would get no more answers, turned to leave. But Whitman's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Be careful, James," he called out, his voice dripping with menace. "The moon is watching." The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, golden hue over the room. James stirred, the events of the previous day weighing heavily on his mind. He reached out, expecting to find Clara beside him, but his hand met only cold, empty sheets. Sitting up with a start, he called out, "Clara?" There was no response. The apartment, which had always been filled with the soft sounds of their shared life, was eerily silent. A sense of unease settled over James as he climbed out of bed. He moved from room to room, calling Clara's name, but there was no sign of her. The bathroom was empty, her toothbrush untouched. The kitchen, too, showed no signs of activity. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But on the dining table, illuminated by the morning light, lay a series of notes, each one meticulously folded and sealed with a wax imprint of a crescent moon. James approached the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He picked up the first note, the paper cool and crisp in his hand. Unfolding it, he read the words written in Clara's elegant script. "To the one who seeks, the moon shall guide." Beneath the message was a drawing, a simple sketch of their apartment building with an arrow pointing towards the rooftop. Confusion and fear gripped James. What did the note mean? Why had Clara left it? And where was she? He grabbed his coat, the urgency of the situation propelling him forward. As he made his way to the rooftop, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Had Clara's obsession with the moon reached a breaking point? Had she been lured away, drawn by some unseen force? The rooftop was deserted, the city stretching out below, its buildings bathed in the soft glow of dawn. But there, on the ledge, was another note, identical to the first. James approached it hesitantly, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He picked it up, unfolding it to reveal another message. "Follow the moon's path, and you shall find." James looked up, his gaze drawn to the horizon where the moon, large and luminous, hung in the sky. And as its silvery light washed over him, he felt a pull, a compulsion to follow, to seek out Clara and unravel the mystery of her disappearance. With a deep breath, he set off, the notes his only guide, the moon his only companion. The city, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, seemed transformed. Streets that James had walked countless times now felt alien, charged with a palpable tension. The moon, hanging low in the sky, cast long shadows that seemed to dance and shift with every step he took. The first note led him to the city's central park, a sprawling expanse of greenery and winding paths. At the entrance stood a statue of Artemis, the moon goddess, her bow drawn and an arrow pointed towards the heart of the park. Beneath her stone feet lay another note. Where water meets light, the moon's reflection shines bright. Drawn by the cryptic message, James made his way to the park's central pond. The water was still, the surface acting as a mirror to the world above. And there in the center floated another note, gently bobbing with the ripples of the water. Using a nearby branch, James carefully retrieved it. In the heart of the city, where time stands still, the moon's message awaits, if you have the will. His mind raced, trying to decipher the clue. Then it hit him. The city's old clock tower, a relic from a bygone era, its hands frozen in time. Without hesitation, he made his way there, the tower's imposing silhouette guiding him. The entrance to the tower was ajar, the interior shrouded in darkness. But as James's eyes adjusted, he noticed a faint glow emanating from the staircase. Climbing the winding steps, he was met with another note, this one illuminated by the soft light of a dozen candles. Where knowledge is kept and stories unfold, seek the moon's wisdom in the tales of old. The city's library, a grand edifice of stone and marble, was his next destination. The building, usually bustling with activity, was eerily silent. Rows upon rows of books stretched out before him, the weight of centuries of knowledge pressing down. And there, in the section dedicated to astronomy and celestial bodies, lay another note. To find what you seek, look to the skies. The moon's final message, a truth in disguise. James felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Each note brought him closer to Clara, but also deeper into the moon's enigmatic web. But he was resolute, determined to follow the trail to its end, wherever it may lead. The city's observatory stood atop a hill, its domed silhouette a sentinel against the night sky. James approached with trepidation, the weight of the previous notes and the ever-looming presence of the moon bearing down on him. The entrance was unlocked, the interior bathed in a soft, silvery light. The hum of machinery and the distant whir of telescopes adjusting their positions filled the air. But it was the faint sound of a familiar voice, singing a haunting lullaby that drew James upwards. Following the sound, he ascended a narrow spiral staircase, each step echoing in the vast chamber. As he reached the top, the singing grew louder, more distinct. And then he saw her. Clara stood on the very edge of the observatory's roof, her silhouette framed against the vast expanse of the night sky. The moon, now at its zenith, cast an ethereal glow upon her, making her appear almost otherworldly. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now held a distant, dreamy quality, as if she were seeing something beyond the realm of human comprehension. "Clara!" James called out, his voice choked with emotion. "Please, come back to me!" She turned to face him, her expression serene. "James," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "Can't you hear it? The moon's song? It's so beautiful." James approached slowly, carefully, every fiber of his being focused on Clara. "I hear you, Clara," he replied, his voice gentle. "And I need you. Please come down." But Clara seemed lost in her own world, her gaze fixed on the moon. "It's calling to me, James," she murmured. "Telling me things, showing me visions. I have to listen." James felt a pang of desperation. He was so close, yet Clara felt miles away, lost in the moon's enigmatic embrace. He had to reach her, to pull her back from the brink. The wind atop the observatory was cold, biting, but James barely felt it. All he felt was the raw, desperate need to reach Clara, to pull her back from the precipice she was teetering on.
"Clara,"
he pleaded, his voice breaking.
"whatever you're seeing, whatever you're hearing, we can face it together. Just step back, please."
She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears that shimmered in the moonlight. "It's so clear now, James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The moon has shown me. I have to go to it, become one with it. It's the only way." James took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Clara, no," he begged. "We have a life together, a future. Don't throw it away." But Clara's gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the first faint hints of dawn were beginning to appear. "It's almost time," she murmured, her voice filled with a strange serenity. "The moon has shown me the way, and I have to follow." With a sudden, swift movement, she stepped off the edge, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. James lunged forward, his fingers grazing hers, but it was too late. She was gone. The world seemed to shatter around him. The observatory, the city, the very sky itself seemed to blur and fade, leaving only the raw, gaping wound of loss. James sank to his knees, his cries of despair echoing into the void. The sun rose, casting its golden light over the city, but for James, the world would forever be shrouded in darkness. As our story comes to a close, let the lull of this soothing ambiance continue to cradle you further into your journey of calmness and rest. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your relaxation and sleep routine tonight. Remember, each day brings a new story, and each night brings a fresh chance to regenerate, to dream, and to become more of who you are. Good night, dear listener. Until our next story, sleep well and dream beautifully.